Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to discuss about a portrait of the artist as a young man by James Joyce. This novel has been written by James Joyce. Let us start with the introduction of modernism because his belonging was from modern era. Now discuss what is modernism in literature. Modernism, a general term applied retrospectively to the wide range of experimental and avant-garde trends in the literature of the early 20th century, including symbolism, futurism, expressionism, imagism, Victorianism, Dada, and Surrealism. Along with the innovations of unaffiliated writers, it would be hard to give a precise and succinct definition of the term modernism as there was no organized group and no manifesto of modernism. Modernism emerged in France during the last quarter of the 19th century with movements such as naturalism, symbolism, decadence, and aestheticism. Early modernism work began to appear in Britain and America from the 1890s, and it remained an influential force right up until the Second World War. Modernism gave a radical break with the past and concurrent search for new forms of expression. Modernism fostered a period of experimentation in the art from the late 19th to the mid 20th century, particularly in the year following World War I. In an era characterized by industrialization, rapid social changes, advances in science and the social sciences, for example, Darwinism, Freudian theory, and modernism felt a growing alienation incompatible with Victorian morality, optimism, and convention. The modernism impulse is fueled in various literature by industrialization and urbanization, by the search for an authentic response to the much charged world. Although the decadent poets of the 1819s, such as Oscar Wilde, Ernest Dawson, Arthur Simon, and W. B. Yeats, who were all influential by the writing of the likes of Baudelaire, Mallarmé, and Valery, had made use of elements of what would later be called modernism. It was a work of American Henry James that really signaled the new direction in literature at the end of the 19th century. Other authors whose work moved in the direction around the same time were Stephen Crane, Joseph Conrad, and Ford Madox. Ford. The works of all these writers were experimental in their structure. They were also engaged with themes of imperialism, urban chaos, and paranoia. James Joyce is perhaps the ultimate modernist. His masterly work Ulysses focuses on just one day monologue, stream of consciousness. Sorry, Ulysses focuses on just one day in the life of two people, using multiple narrators, interior monologue, stream of consciousness, literary parody, and stylistic changes. Few have managed successfully to follow his lead, but his influence can be felt in the works of writers such as O'Brien and Malcolm Lowry, whose Under the Volcano takes place over the course of a single day. D. H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf were both heavily influenced by Fried Wolf. In novels such as Mrs. Dalloway and The Year employed much structural experimentation, while Lawrence, though using more traditional narrative form, was poetic and emotional in style and daring in his subject matter. Modernist literature is characterized chiefly by rejection of 19th century traditions and of their consensus between author and the reader. The conventions of realism, for instance, were abandoned by Franz Kafka and other novelists, and by expressionist drama, while several poets rejected traditional meters in favor of free verse. Modernist writers tended to see themselves as an avant garde, disengaged from bourgeois values, and sometimes confused their readers by adopting complex and difficult new forms and styles. In fiction, the accepted continuity of chronological development was upset by Joseph Conrad, Marcel Proust, and William Faulkner, while James Joyce and Virginia Woolf attempted new ways of tracing the flow of characters' thought in their streams of consciousness style. In poetry as a pound, and T.S. Eliot replaced the logical exposition of thought with collages of fragmentary images and complex allusion. Luigi Parandillo and Bertolt Brecht opened up the theatre to new forms of abstraction in place of realist and naturalist representation. Modernist writing is predominantly cosmopolitan and often expresses a sense of urban cultural dislocation along with an awareness of new anthropological and psychological theories. Its favored techniques of juxtaposition and multiple points of view view challenge the reader to re-establish a coherence of meaning from fragmentary forms. Historical, social, and cultural background of modernism. The two devastating, almost global wars, World War One, 1914 to 1918, and World War Two, 1941 to 1945, brought huge changes in industry and technology as compared to the 19th century. It also gave rise and power to the international corporations and it reshaped the economy of the West. The cultural exchanges, transportation, communication, mass, uh, formerly traditional societies and nations and resulted into a change in their values. These modern values included a belief in the desirability of industrialization, individual politics, rights, democracy, math literacy, and education, private ownership of the means of production, the scientific method, public institutions like those in the West, middle class Western value system, are disbelief in or at least a questioning of the existence of God and sometimes the emancipation of women. Modernist writers proclaimed a new subject matter for literature and they felt that their new way of looking at life required a new form, a new way of writing. Writers of this period tend to pursue more experimental and usually more highly individualistic forms of writing. The sense of a changing world was stimulated by radical new developments, such as new insights from the emerging fields of psychology and sociology, anthropological studies of comparative religion, and new theories of electromagnetism and quantum physics. There was a growing critique of British imperialism and the ideology of empire, while in Germany there was the growing force of doctrines of radical superiority. The other remarkable developments were the escalation of warfare to global level, the avant-garde of the advent of mass democracy and the rise of mass communication and the shifting power structure, particularly as women entered the workforce. The literature of the modern period has its roots in the literature of Europe and grows out of a reaction to realism and naturalism. As a reaction against realism and naturalism, some critics see in modernists at least four isms or literary movements that make up the literature of modern era: Impressionism, Expressionism, Surrealism, and Nihilism. Realism attempted to portray external objects and events as the common or middle class man sees them in everyday life. Impressionism tries to portray the psychological impressions these objects and events make on character, emphasizing the role of individual perception and exploring the nature of the conscious and unconscious mind. Realism tried to focus on these external objects and events. Expressionism tried to express the inner vision, the inner emotion, or the inner spiritual reality and seem more important than the external realities of objects and events. Realism focused on external objects and events as they are. Surrealism tried to liberate the subconscious to see connections overlooked and so by the logical mind to deny the supreme authority of rationality and so portray objects and events as they seem rather than as they are, whereas realism tried to show the supreme importance of rational and reason. Absurdism tried to duplicate in literature the absurd condition of contemporary life, the Holocaust, a world in which mankind afloat in a chartless and unknowable world, void of a spiritual center, are ultimate absurd circumstances in which contemporary humankind found itself. The next point is, what are the characteristics of modernism? Now, the answer is that it is generally agreed that the movement was cross disciplinary, dominated by its own myth of discontinuity, full urban and technological in nature, extreme self consciousness in avant garde and experimental facets, and characterized by with an elitist sensibility and an egotistical valuing of the self. These last two features offended many at the time and other since, even more so than that, its insistent questioning of received values and convention, its revolutionary manifestos, and its outright rejection of the weight of conservative conventions and wars that had been gathering force in Europe. The Congress Vienna in 1819. Since the Congress of Vienna in 1815, moreover, as with classical Athens and Renaissance Europe, much of the naturalism of modernism came from a deep pessimism and the association with irrational forces. As early as 1891, Thomas Hardy had labeled the new cultural restiveness the ache of modernism, a label that became more and more appropriate as modernism reached its height during the 1920s. The era of modernist literature is one that is associated with the side of life that every person experiences but does not really understand. One of the dominant features of modernism is a feeling of alienation or estrangement. This often is a feeling of being alone in the universal that one lives in. When this happens, there are no community feelings or any sense of belonging. Not only does this theme cause the character to be merely, but many times it makes them angry or depressed. A second theme that shows up in most modern literature is doubt. It may be disbelief in religion, in happiness, or simply a check of purpose and doubt in the value of human life. Finally, a third theme that is prevalent is the search for the truth. The alienated character asks why and seeks answer regarding human subjectivity. All of these themes that are found in modernism are a result of the identity of the person. The identity can be combination of language, economic class, gender, race, and where one lives. These three themes can be written in several of the works of modern literature to varying extents. Writing of the modernist period exhibit features such as experimentation, anti-realism, individualism, and intellectualism. Modernist writers had deep belief that previous writing was stereotyped and inadequate. They deviate from the norm of from usual reader expectation ruthlessly the past. The themes and vantage point chosen to question the conventional view. Modernist literature presents a world seen through the artist's inner feeling, mental states. Thus, there is a promotion of the artist's viewpoint at the expense of communal cultivation of an individual myth and unconscious forces rather than motivation. Conventional plot. One feature above all is striking in modernism experimentation, change for the sake of change, a need to constantly at the cutting edge in technique and thought. My, it's new, said Pound. Perhaps this was understandable. Society itself changing rapidly. The First World War shattered many beliefs in peaceful progresses, international cooperation, the purity of the European civilization. It also outlaws high minded and heroic vocabulary, gallant vanquish fate, etc., could afterwards many only be used in an or jocular way. But more fundamental was the 19th century growth in city life, in industrial employment, universal literacy, and the power of mass patronage. And the science and society could evolve and innovate, so why not? No doubt the shallow optimism, humbug, and economic exploitation and the industrialization revolution was very attracted by, so then was rural poverty. Excepting the Georgian, some of the ardent generation, few poets of the last human years had first-hand experience of the social issues of the, and there are large areas of contemporary life even now are not scarcely treated. The world of work, public service, cultural differences. Either the literary prototypes do not or write would have to give up an individualist view and dig out the facts. For example, write something close journalism. Art prides itself on its more fundamental qualities. It did not have the time, training, or intellectual power. Understanding the contemporary world, artists would look shorter path to their subject matter. Hence, the championing of the artist's viewpoint on the vision unmediated by social understanding. Hence, in modernism literature, there is an appeal to, if not the understanding of psychiatry, mythology, and linguistics, to assert the artistic creation do not represent reality but in some sense embody reality. Poems should not express anything but themselves. They should simply be. Many techniques were used to distance language from its common uses and assert its primary self-validating focus. Sorry status. And since proficiency in science and business requires a long practical training, literature also insisted on study courses. A good deal needs to be swallowed before the student's eyes are open to the possible excellences of contemporary writing. Maybe they are invisible to the general public or even in rival sects, but that is not a drawback. Art is not for the profane majority and its boundaries are carefully patrolled. Art may employ populist material or techniques, but it cannot be populist itself. The modernist writers and their commentators do not regard the narrowly individual outlook or shortcoming, quite the opposite. The learning of modernist writers tend to be fragmentary, with ideas serving ulterior purpose, one of which is social distinction. There is a persistent strain of intellectual snobbery in modernism, sometimes breaking out in racism and contempt for the masses, sometimes retreating to arcane philosophy, idealism, existentialism, post structuralism. Modernists are an aristocracy of the intellect. The cerebral is preferred. Modern dramatists and novelists may appeal to mythology, but their understanding is intellectualized. Work is not crafted to evoke the primal forces, unleashed and placed by Euripides or Racine, but shaped by concepts that serve for plot and structure. Those pieces of literature we call modern often use images, word pictures, and symbols are as typical and frequent. Literary techniques. There is the use of colloquial language rather than formal language. They use language in a very self conscious way, seeing language as a technique for uh, crafting the piece of literature, just as an artist crafts a piece of art like sculpture or a painting. Language to the modernist is as a special medium that influences what that piece of literature can do or can be. Form, style, and technique thus become as important, if not more so, than content or substance. Very often, the intention of modernists is to change the way readers see the world and to change our understanding of what language is and does. Modernist fiction. The term modernist refers to the radical shift in aesthetic and cultural sensibilities evident in the art and literature of the post World War period. The order, stable and inherently sorry inherently meaningful world view of the 19th century could not rotiously accord with the immense panorama of futility and anarchy which is contemporary history. Modernism thus marks a distinctive break with Victorian bourgeois morality, rejecting 19th century optimism. They presented a profoundly pessimistic picture of a culture in disarray. This appear often result in an apparent apathy and moral relativism. In fiction, the movement is associated with deep Franz Kafka and not Hamsun. In their attempt to throw off the aesthetic burden of the realist novel, these writers introduce a variety of literary tactics and devices. The radical disruption of linear flow of narrative, the frustration of conventional expectations concerning unity and coherence, plot and character, and the cause and effect development thereof. The deployment of ironic and ambiguous juxtaposition to call into question the moral and philosophical meaning of literary action. The adoption of a tone epistemological self mockery aimed at naive pretentious bourgeois rationality. The opposition of inward consciousness to rational public objective discourse and inclination subjective distortion to point of the evanescence of the social world of the 19th century bourgeois. Modernism is often derided for abandoning the social world in favor of its narcissistic interest in language and its processes, recognizing the failure of language to over fully communicate meaning. The modernists generally downplayed content in favor of an investigation of form. The fragmented, non chronological poetic forms utilized by Eliot and Pound revolutionized poetic language. Modernists formalized, however, was not without its political cost. Many of the chief modernists either flirted with fascism or openly espoused it. Eliot, Yeats, Hamsun, and Pound. They should not be surprising. Modernism in a markedly egalitarian, its disregard for the shared conventions of meaning make many of its supreme accomplishments. Joyce, Finnegan Wake, Wolf the Waves, largely inaccessible to the common reader. For Eliot, such obscure, uh, sorry, obscure absurdism were necessary to halt the erosion of art in the age of commodity circulation and the literature adjusted to the lowest common denominator. Modernist literature was a tendency to lack traditional chronological narrative, break narrative frames, or move from one level of narrative to another without any warning through the world of a number of different narrators. It may also be self reflexive about the act of writing and the nature of literature. Much use is made of the stream of consciousness technique and focusing on a character consciousness and subconscious. The writing of Sigmund Freud were highly influential on the moment is a recurring technique. Unlike the literature of the 19th century, there is a breaking down of the traditional beginning, middle, and linear narrative in the modernist novel, leaving an impression of enigma and open endedness to the work. So, now we are going to end the modern literature, or what is modernism in literature. So, we are going to discuss about its conclusion or concluding points. Modernism describes a set of cultural tendency and an array of associated cultural movement, originally arising from wide-scale and far-reaching changes to Western society in the late 19th and early 20th century. The term encompasses activities and output of those who felt the traditional form of art, architecture, literature, religious faith, social organization, and daily life were becoming outdated in the new economic, social, and political condition of an emerging fully industrialized world. Modernism rejected the lingering certainty of Enlightenment thinking. Modernism can be viewed as a questioning of the axioms of the previous age. Modernism also led to experiments with farm and work that draws attention to the processes and material use. Ezra Pound's paradigmatic injection was the way it knew, whether or not the making knew of the modernist constituted a new historical epoch is up for debate. Philosopher and composer Theodor Adorno warns us modernity is a qualitative, not a chronological category. Just as it cannot be reduced to abstract form with equal necessity, it must turn its back on conventional surface coherence, the appearance of harmony, the order corroborated merely by replication. Adorno would have and understand modernity as the rejection of the false rationality, harmony, and coherence of Enlightenment thinking. Pound's general imperative to make new and Adorno exhortation to challenge false coherence and harmony faces. T.S. Eliot's the 20th century most important critic Thomas Stearns Eliot emphasizes on the relation of the artist to tradition. Eliot wrote, "We shall often find that not only the best but the most individual part of a poet's work may be those in which the dead poet, his ancestor, assert their immortality most vigorously." Literary scholar Peter Child sum up by the complexity. There were paradoxical, if not opposed, trends toward revolutionary and reactionary position, fear of the new and delight at the disappearance of the old, real nihilism and fanatical enthusiasm, creativity and despair. These opposition are inherent to modernism. It is in its broadest culture sense the assessment to the inherent to modernism. It is in its broadest cultural sense the assessment of the past as different to the modern age, the recognition that the world was becoming more complex, that the old final authority were subject to intense critical scrutiny. Current interpretation of modern whereas some divide 20th century action into modernism and postmodernism, whereas others see them as two aspects of the same movement. In fact, modernism flourished mainly in consumer capitalist society, despite the fact that its proponent often rejected consumerism itself. However, high modernism began to merge with consumer culture after World War II, especially during the 1960s. This emerging of consumer and high version of modernist culture led to a radical transformation of the meaning of modernism. First, it implied that a movement based on the rejection of tradition had become a tradition of its own. Second, it demonstrated that the distinction between elite modernism and mass consumerist culture had lost its precision. Some writers declared that modernism had become so institutionalized that it was now post avant garde, indicating that it had lost its power as a revolutionary movement. Many have interpreted this transformation as the beginning of the phase that became known as postmodernism. For others, such as art critic Robert Hughes, postmodernism represents an extension of modernism. Modernism evolved by various routes. Some symbolism it took elusiveness in style and interest in rare feat mental states. From realism, it borrowed an urban setting and a willingness to break taboos. And from romanticism came an artist centered view and retreat into irrationalism and hallucination. Even its founding father did not long remain modernist. Pound espoused doctrinate, doctrinary right wing view. And Eliot became a religious convert. Joyce's late work verged on the surrealistic levels called with everyone. No one would willingly lose the best that has been written in the last 100 years, but earlier doubts are coming home to roost. Modernism, ruthlessly self promotion, creates intellectual castes that cut themselves off from the hopes and joys of everyday life. The poetry can build on the flim- flimsiest of foundation, Freudian psychiatry, verbal cleverness, individualism run riot, anti realism, overemphasis on the irrational. The concepts themselves are fraudulent, and the sporting myths too small and self admiring to show man in his fullest nature. Sales of early modernist work were most probably small, and it was large after the Second World War, when the disciples of modern rose to positions of influence in the academic and publishing world. That modernism came the lingua franca of the educated classes. The older generation of readers gradually died out. Literature for them was connoisseurship, a lifetime of deepening familiarity with authors who couldn't be analyzed in a critical theory or packed into 3 years undergraduate courses. Modernism is an encompassing label for a wide variety of cultural movement, while postmodernism is essentially a centralized movement that names itself based on socio-political theory, although the term is now used in a wider sense to refer to activities from the 20th century onward which exhibit awareness of and reinterpret the modern. It asserts that the attempt to canonize modernism after the fact is doomed to ambiguable contradiction. In a narrower sense, what was modernism was not necessarily also postmodernism. Those elements of modernism which accentuated the benefits of rationality and socio technological progress were only modernist. Anti modernist or counter modernist movements seek to emphasize holism, connection, and spirituality as remedies or antidotes to modernism. Such movements see modernism as reduction and therefore subject to an inability to see systematic and emergent effects. Many modernists came to this viewpoint. For example, Paul Hindemith, in his late turn towards mysticism, writers such as Paul H. Ray and Sherry Ruth Anderson in The Cultural Creatives, How 50 Million People Are Changing the World, Frederick Turner in The Culture of Hope, and Lester Brown in Plan B have articulated a critique of the basic idea of modernism itself, that individual creative expression should conform to the realities of technology. Instead, they argue individual creativity should make everyday life more emotionally acceptable. Now this is it नाज़रीन, आज के लिए हमारे पास अ पोर्ट्रेट ऑफ द आर्टिस्ट एज अ यंग मैन, जहाँ पे हम मॉडर्निज़म, व्हाट इज़ मॉडर्निज़म और इसके कुछ इम्पॉर्टेंट एस्पेक्ट्स पॉइंट्स पढ़ रहे थे आज। उसका हमने तमाम जो है ना पॉइंट वन बाय वन डिस्कस किए हैं। होप सो यू लाइक माय वीडियो। Next time we shall come with some new points, with some new topic, and gradually we will discuss about this novel fully. Hope so you like my video. If you like my video, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe my channel, and press the bell icon below to get my latest and new videos on new topics. Allah Hafiz.